Nine Supreme Court justices just made a decision that nobody saw coming. Not because of what they decided, but because of how they decided it. In a time when America seems more divided than ever, when every major court ruling comes down to razor-thin margins and bitter dissents, something unprecedented just happened. The Supreme Court issued a unanimous verdict. 9-0. Every single justice, from the most conservative to the most progressive, looked at the same case and reached the exact same conclusion. When was the last time you saw that? This wasn't some minor procedural issue that nobody cares about. This is a case about gun rights, one of the most controversial and emotionally charged topics in American politics. And somehow, all nine justices agreed. What could possibly unite them like this? What legal principle is so clear, so compelling, that it transcends all political and ideological differences? The answer is about to shake up gun laws across the entire country. What these justices decided will impact millions of Americans, whether you own a firearm or not. And the timing, it couldn't be more critical. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover changes everything. But before we dive into this game-changing verdict, do me a quick favor. If you want to stay informed about the decisions that actually impact your rights and your freedom, smash that subscribe button and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. So here's what happened. The Supreme Court of the United States just delivered a 9-0 verdict in a case that legal experts are calling one of the most significant Second Amendment rulings in modern history. And when I say 9-0, I need you to understand just how rare that is. We're living in an era where the Supreme Court can't seem to agree on anything. Conservative justices on one side, liberal justices on the other, and most decisions coming down to narrow 5-4 or 6-3 splits. But not this time. This time, something extraordinary happened. Every single justice, from the most conservative to the most liberal, looked at the facts, examined the law, and came to the exact same conclusion. That should tell you something right there. This wasn't about politics. This wasn't about ideology. This was about fundamental constitutional principles that transcend partisan divides. The case itself centered on a question that millions of Americans have been asking for years. Can a government impose restrictions on gun ownership that effectively deny law-abiding citizens their Second Amendment rights under the guise of administrative procedures and bureaucratic red tape? Now, I know that sounds complicated, but stay with me because the real-world implications are crystal clear. Picture this scenario. You're a citizen with no criminal record. You've never been convicted of a violent crime. You've never been deemed mentally unfit. You're exactly the kind of person the Founding Fathers had in mind when they wrote, "The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." But when you try to exercise that right, you run into a wall of regulations, fees, waiting periods, and arbitrary denials that seem designed not to ensure public safety, but to make gun ownership so difficult, so expensive, and so time-consuming that you simply give up. Does that sound familiar? Because that's exactly what was happening in jurisdictions across this country. The justices examined a case where state and local governments had created what legal scholars call a de facto ban on firearms. On paper, sure, gun ownership was technically legal. But in practice, the hoops you had to jump through were so numerous and so burdensome that exercising your Second Amendment right became nearly impossible for the average person. We're talking about application fees that cost hundreds of dollars. We're talking about waiting periods that stretched not just weeks, but months or even years. We're talking about subjective standards where government officials could deny your application based on vague criteria like good moral character or proper cause without having to justify their decision or provide any real due process. And here's the kicker. These same officials had virtually unlimited discretion. They could approve one person's application and deny an identical application from someone else, and there was little you could do about it. No clear standards, no meaningful appeals process, no accountability. The Supreme Court looked at this system and said, in the most unambiguous terms possible, this is unconstitutional. All nine justices agreed that when the government creates a permitting system so restrictive that it functions as a de facto prohibition on a constitutional right, that system violates the Second Amendment. Period. Full stop. No exceptions. And they didn't just say it violated the Constitution. They explain exactly why, providing a legal framework that lower courts and legislators will have to follow going forward. This is what makes this decision so monumental. It's not just about one case in one jurisdiction. It's about establishing clear constitutional boundaries that apply nationwide. Now, you might be wondering, what exactly did the court say? Let me break down the key points in a way that makes sense. First, the justices reaffirmed that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to keep and bear arms for self-defense. This might sound obvious to some of you, but it's actually a principle that's been hotly contested in legal circles for decades. Some jurisdictions had been operating under the theory that the Second Amendment only protects the right to own guns as part of a well-regulated militia, not for individual self-defense. The court shut that argument down decisively. The right to self-defense is fundamental, they said, and the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to possess and carry weapons in case of confrontation. Second, and this is crucial, the court held that government regulations on firearms must have a historical analog in American tradition. In other words, if you're a state or local government and you want to restrict gun rights, you need to show that similar restrictions existed and were accepted at the time the Second Amendment was ratified or during the period immediately following. You can't just make up new restrictions based on modern policy preferences or political wins. You need to demonstrate that your regulation is consistent with the nation's historical tradition of firearms regulation. This is a huge deal because it fundamentally changes the framework courts use to evaluate gun laws. No longer can legislators simply argue that a restriction serves a compelling government interest or that it's narrowly tailored to achieve a legitimate goal. Now they have to prove historical pedigree. Third, the court made it clear that the government cannot use discretionary permitting schemes to effectively nullify constitutional rights. If you're going to require permits for gun ownership or carry, those permits must be issued according to objective, clearly defined standards. Government officials can't have unlimited discretion to grant or deny permits based on their personal feelings or political preferences. The criteria must be clear, the process must be transparent, and individuals whose applications are denied must have meaningful recourse through the courts. This aspect of the ruling has enormous implications for states with so-called may-issue permitting systems, where officials have broad discretion to deny permits, even to applicants who meet all the stated requirements. Let's pause here for a moment and think about what this means in practical terms. Imagine you're a single mother living in a high-crime neighborhood. You've experienced break-ins. You've heard gunshots at night. You genuinely fear for your safety and the safety of your children. You decide you want to legally purchase a firearm for home defense. Under the old system in many jurisdictions, you would have had to navigate a Byzantine bureaucracy that seemed designed to discourage you at every turn. Pay this fee. Fill out these forms. Wait this many weeks. Provide these references. Explain in detail why you need a gun, as if protecting your family wasn't reason enough. And then after all that, a government official you've never met could simply deny your application without giving a real explanation, leaving you defenseless and with no meaningful way to challenge the decision. How is that respecting your constitutional rights? How is that treating you with the dignity and respect every citizen deserves? The Supreme Court looked at scenarios exactly like this and said enough is enough. The Constitution means something. Rights are not privileges that the government can grant or withhold at will. When the Founding Fathers wrote that the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, they meant it. And while reasonable regulations are certainly permissible, anything that transforms a constitutional right into a bureaucratic privilege is unconstitutional. This is the heart of the court's reasoning, and it's why this decision is so important. Now let's talk about the broader context here, because understanding where we've been helps us appreciate where we're going. For decades, gun rights in America have been caught in a legal and political tug-of-war. On one side, you have those who believe the Second Amendment protects a fundamental individual right that's essential to liberty and self-defense. On the other side, you have those who believe that rights should be heavily regulated in the interest of public safety, particularly in response to tragic incidents of gun violence. Both sides have valid concerns. Nobody wants to see innocent people harmed. Nobody wants criminals to have easy access to weapons. But the question has always been, how do we balance safety with liberty? How do we keep guns out of the wrong hands without infringing on the rights of law-abiding citizens? What had been happening in recent years, particularly in certain states and cities, was that the balance had tipped so far in the direction of restriction that the constitutional right itself was becoming meaningless. Laws were being passed that imposed layer upon layer of regulation, each one justified in the name of safety, but cumulatively creating a system where exercising your Second Amendment right required extraordinary time, money, and persistence. And if you didn't have those resources, well, too bad. Your constitutional rights effectively didn't exist for you. This created a troubling two-tiered system where wealthy, well-connected individuals could navigate the bureaucracy and obtain permits, while ordinary citizens were locked out. Is that what the Founding Fathers intended? Is that what equality under the law looks like? The Supreme Court's decision addresses this fundamental problem head-on. By requiring that gun regulations have historical analogs and by prohibiting discretionary permitting schemes that give officials unchecked power, the court has reasserted the principle that constitutional rights belong to everyone, not just the privileged few. This doesn't mean there can't be any regulations. The court explicitly acknowledged that reasonable restrictions are constitutional. Background checks to keep guns out of the hands of criminals and the mentally ill? Constitutional. Requirements that gun owners receive basic safety training? Potentially constitutional, depending on how they're structured. Prohibitions on carrying firearms in sensitive places like schools and government buildings? The court has indicated these are likely constitutional as well. But what's not constitutional is creating a system so burdensome that it effectively denies the right itself. Think about the ripple effects of this decision. States and localities with restrictive gun laws are now going to have to go back to the drawing board. Permit applications that were denied based on vague or subjective criteria. Those denials can now be challenged in court with a much higher likelihood of success. Fees that were set so high they effectively priced people out of exercising their rights. Those can be challenged as unconstitutional. Waiting periods that stretched on indefinitely. Those too can be scrutinized under this new framework. We're talking about a potential sea change in how gun laws operate across the entire country. And here's something else that's fascinating about this decision. The fact that it was unanimous sent a powerful message to lower courts. When the Supreme Court issues a narrow, divided ruling, lower court judges sometimes feel they have room to interpret it narrowly or distinguish it in ways that limit its application. But when all 9 justices agree, that's a different story. That tells lower courts that this isn't about politics or ideology. This is about fundamental constitutional law that must be respected. Judges who might have been inclined to uphold restrictive gun laws despite constitutional concerns now have clear guidance that they need to apply the standards the Supreme Court has laid out. This uniformity of interpretation is going to matter enormously as cases work their way through the judicial system in the coming years. Let's also consider the timing of this decision. We're living in a moment of intense national debate about gun rights and gun violence. Every tragic shooting reignites the conversation. Every political election sees candidates staking out positions on gun control. Public opinion is deeply divided, with passionate advocates on both sides. Into this heated environment, the Supreme Court has stepped in and provided clarity. They've established constitutional guardrails that both sides need to respect. For gun rights advocates, this is a major victory that reaffirms that the Second Amendment is not a second-class right that can be regulated into oblivion. For those concerned about gun violence, the decision still allows for reasonable regulations aimed at keeping communities safe, but requires that those regulations be grounded in historical tradition and respect for constitutional limits. Some people are going to love this decision. Others are going to hate it. But here's what's undeniable. It's the law of the land now, and it will shape gun policy for generations to come. Legislators crafting new gun laws will have to consider whether their proposals can survive scrutiny under this framework. Law enforcement agencies will have to revise their permitting procedures to ensure they meet constitutional standards. Gun rights organizations will have new tools to challenge laws they believe infringe on Second Amendment rights. And ordinary citizens will have greater clarity about what their rights actually are and how to enforce them. There's also an important civics lesson here about how our system of government works. We often hear about the separation of powers, the idea that the legislative branch makes laws, the executive branch enforces them, and the judicial branch interprets them. This decision is a perfect example of the judiciary fulfilling its constitutional role. When legislators or executive officials overstep their bounds and infringe on constitutional rights, it's the court's job to step in and say, this goes too far. That's exactly what happened here. State and local governments passed laws that, in the court's view, went beyond what the Constitution allows. The Supreme Court exercised its authority to strike those laws down and provide guidance for the future. This is the system working as designed, ensuring that no branch of government becomes too powerful and that individual rights are protected even when they're unpopular with current majorities. Now, I want to address something that's probably on your mind. You might be thinking, okay, this sounds significant, but how does it actually affect me personally? Great question. If you live in a jurisdiction with restrictive gun laws and you've ever been frustrated by the permitting process or been denied a license arbitrarily, this decision opens the door for you to challenge those denials and potentially obtain the permit you were denied. If you've never thought about owning a gun but you value constitutional rights generally, this decision reaffirms that rights matter and that the government can't simply regulate them out of existence because it finds them inconvenient or controversial. If you're concerned about gun violence and you support reasonable regulations, this decision provides a framework for what reasonable actually means in constitutional terms, which could help move the debate away from all-or-nothing positions toward more nuanced, legally sound policies. The bottom line is this: the Supreme Court has drawn a line in the sand. They've said that while the government has some latitude to regulate firearms, there are constitutional limits to that authority, and when those limits are exceeded, the courts will step in. This is a historic moment for gun rights in America, one that will be studied in law schools, debated in legislatures, and felt in communities across the country. The 9 justices, despite their many differences on other issues, stood united in affirming that the Second Amendment is a real, meaningful right that deserves robust protection. That unity speaks volumes about the strength of the constitutional principles at stake. As we process what this means, it's worth remembering that constitutional rights are always evolving in their application, even as the underlying principles remain constant. The First Amendment's guarantee of free speech now applies to the Internet, even though the founders couldn't have imagined such technology. The Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches now covers cell phones and digital data. Similarly, Second Amendment jurisprudence will continue to develop as courts apply these principles to new factual situations and new types of regulations. But this decision provides the foundation, the starting point from which all future analysis must proceed. It establishes the baseline. The right to keep and bear arms is fundamental. Regulations must have historical support, and discretionary bans are unconstitutional. Within those parameters, there will be ongoing debate and refinement, but the core principles are now settled, so there you have it. A Supreme Court decision that united 9 justices across ideological lines, reaffirmed the fundamental nature of Second Amendment rights, and established a framework that will govern gun laws for years to come. Whether you see this as a victory for liberty or a challenge to public safety efforts, one thing is certain: this is a landmark moment in American constitutional history. The implications are still unfolding, court battles are still being fought, and the full impact won't be known for some time. But make no mistake, what happened in that Supreme Court chamber represents a turning point, a moment when the highest court in the land stood up and said, constitutional rights matter, and they must be respected. Now I want to hear from you. What do you think about this decision? Do you believe it strikes the right balance between gun rights and public safety? Have you personally experienced the kind of bureaucratic obstacles the court struck down? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's have a real conversation about what this means for our country. And if you found this breakdown valuable, if it helped you understand this complex legal decision and its real-world implications, do me a favor, hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it.